I thought my aunt was my best friend until I found out she sabotaged my job to protect her son, and then If you asked me a year ago who my best friend was, I would have said, without hesitation, my Aunt Vicky. She was the kind of aunt everyone wished they had. Charming, supportive, and just edgy enough to make her feel more like a friend than family. While my mom, Rebecca, was strict and focused on my academic success, Aunt Vicky always encouraged me to chase my dreams. She'd sit with me late at night, sharing advice, laughing at our favorite sitcoms, and talking about how Mason and I were destined for greatness. Mason, her son, was more like my brother than my cousin. We grew up together, sharing toys, secrets, and a lot of competitive energy. He was the golden boy in our family, the one who always seemed to have everything handed to him. But I never really resented him. I just figured he was luckier than me, and besides, Aunt Vicky made it clear that she wanted both of us to succeed. That's why it felt so surreal when I landed my dream job and noticed tension brewing within the family. I had always been a bit of an underdog. I worked hard through college, juggling internships and part-time jobs while Mason seemed to glide effortlessly through life. Don't get me wrong, Mason wasn't lazy. He was talented, charming, and had a knack for getting what he wanted. But he didn't have the same hunger I did. When I scored a position at a prestigious marketing firm after months of relentless applications and interviews, I thought my family would be proud of me. And they were, at least at first. "I always knew you'd make it big, Zach," Aunt Vicky exclaimed during a small family dinner to celebrate my new job. "You've got that spark." "Right, Mason?" Mason had smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, congrats, man. That's huge." I didn't think much of it then. Mason was struggling to find a stable job after a series of dead-end internships, and I figured he was just frustrated with himself. I tried not to feel guilty about my success. After all, I'd worked my ass off to get here. The first few months at my new job were incredible. My boss, James, was a no-nonsense kind of guy, but he appreciated hard work and rewarded initiative. Olivia, my mentor, was a powerhouse in the industry. She took me under her wing, teaching me the ropes and making sure I had opportunities to shine. I even started forming a close friendship with Harper, a coworker whose creativity and wit made every day more enjoyable. Things were going so well that I barely noticed when subtle cracks began forming in my life. It started with a seemingly routine meeting with HR. Emma, the HR manager, looked unusually serious as she slid a folder across the table toward me. "We've received a few complaints about your behavior, Zach," she said, her tone professional but clipped. "Complaints?" I blinked, utterly blindsided. "What kind of complaints?" Emma pursed her lips. "There have been concerns about your communication style. Some of your colleagues feel that you've been dismissive and unapproachable." I was floored. I'd always gone out of my way to be friendly and approachable at work. I'd even stayed late to help a coworker finish a project last week. The accusations didn't make sense. "I'm sorry, but this is the first I'm hearing of any issues," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you tell me who filed these complaints?" "I can't disclose that," Emma replied, "but I recommend you reflect on how you interact with your team. These concerns could escalate if they're not addressed." I walked out of that meeting feeling like I'd been sucker punched. I replayed every interaction I'd had at work, trying to pinpoint where I might have gone wrong. But no matter how hard I thought about it, I couldn't come up with anything. That evening, I called Natalie, my closest friend, to vent. Natalie and I had been friends since college, and she was the kind of person who always gave it to me straight. "That's weird, Zach," she said after I explained what had happened. "You're one of the most easygoing people I know. Are you sure this isn't some kind of misunderstanding?" "I don't know," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. Emma seemed pretty serious. "What if I really did something wrong and didn't realize it?" Natalie sighed. "Look, you're not perfect, but this feels off. You said it came out of nowhere, right?" "Yeah. Then maybe someone's trying to stir up trouble for you," she suggested. "Have you pissed anyone off lately?" I laughed bitterly. "Not that I know of. Unless someone hates how I refill the coffee machine." "Don't joke," Natalie said. "Think about it. If someone wanted to sabotage you, they'd start with little things like this. Keep your guard up." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. A week later, things took an even stranger turn. Mason called me out of the blue, something he hadn't done in months. "Hey, Zach," he said, his voice unusually upbeat. "I wanted to tell you some good news. I got hired at this new tech startup. The pay's great, and the team seems solid." "That's awesome, Mason," I said, genuinely happy for him. "Congrats." "Yeah, thanks," he said. There was a pause before he added, "How's your job going?" "It's fine," I said cautiously. "Why?" "No reason. Just checking in." The conversation felt oddly strained, but I brushed it off. Mason had a way of making things awkward without meaning to. Still, something about his tone nagged at me. The final straw came during another family dinner a few days later. Aunt Vicky had cooked up a feast, and everyone was in high spirits. I was in the kitchen refilling my drink when I overheard Aunt Vicky and Mason talking in hushed voices. "You just need to stay focused," Aunt Vicky was saying. "This is your chance to get ahead." "What about Zach?" Mason asked, his voice tense. "Don't worry about Zach," Aunt Vicky said. "I'll take care of it." I froze, my heart pounding. What the hell did she mean by that? I didn't have time to dwell on it because they came into the kitchen a moment later, both of them smiling like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying their conversation in my head. For the first time, I began to wonder if Natalie was right. Maybe I wasn't imagining things. Maybe someone really was trying to sabotage me. And maybe that someone was Aunt Vicky. The conversation I overheard between Aunt Vicky and Mason haunted me for days. I told myself I was overthinking it, that maybe it was nothing more than a pep talk for Mason. But the way she said, "I'll take care of it," refused to leave my mind. What did she mean? And why was Mason worried about me? At work, things were getting worse. James called me into his office one morning, his face unreadable as he gestured for me to sit. "We need to talk, Zach," he began. "I've been hearing some troubling things." "What things?" I asked, my stomach twisting into a knot. "Some of your teammates have raised concerns about your leadership on projects. They feel like you're not collaborating effectively, and it's impacting the team's morale." I blinked in disbelief. "James, I don't understand. I've been working closely with everyone. I haven't had any complaints brought to me directly." "That may be the problem," James said, his tone sharp. "If your team doesn't feel comfortable bringing their concerns to you, it's on you to create that environment." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but I could tell from his expression that it wouldn't help. "I'll work on it," I said instead, my voice stiff. "You'd better," James replied. "This is a high-pressure environment, Zach. If you can't keep up, there are plenty of people who'd be happy to take your place." After that meeting, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. I started second-guessing everything I did, wondering if I was somehow the problem. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. My interactions at work had always been professional, even friendly. If there were issues, why was I only hearing about them now? Natalie's words came back to me. Asterisk, maybe someone's trying to stir up trouble for you. Asterisk. That night, I called her again. "I think you might be right," I said as soon as she picked up. "Right about what?" she asked. "About someone trying to sabotage me," I replied. I told her about my conversation with James and how none of the complaints against me lined up with my actual experiences at work. "That's so weird," Natalie said when I finished. "Have you noticed anyone acting differently toward you?" I thought about it. Most of my coworkers had been treating me the same as always, but there were a few who'd started avoiding eye contact or cutting conversations short. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it seemed suspicious. "I don't know," I admitted. "I guess I'll have to pay more attention." "Good idea," Natalie said. "And keep your guard up. Whoever's behind this isn't done yet." The family tension escalated a few days later. Aunt Vicky invited me over for lunch, something she hadn't done in a while. I was hesitant, but I figured it was better to face her directly than keep speculating. When I arrived, she greeted me with her usual warmth, pulling me into a tight hug. "Zachary, it's so good to see you," she said, her smile bright. "You too, Aunt Vicky," I replied, forcing a smile of my own. We sat at the kitchen table, eating sandwiches and chatting about small things. She asked about work, and I kept my answers vague, not wanting to give her too much information. She seemed genuinely interested, nodding and asking follow-up questions. But then she said something that set off alarm bells. "You know, Zach," she began, her tone casual. "Mason's been feeling a bit insecure lately. He looks up to you so much, and I think he's worried he'll never measure up." I frowned. Why would he feel that way? Mason's got so much going for him. Aunt Vicky sighed, her expression sympathetic. "He does, but you know how competitive he can be. Sometimes he feels like he's in your shadow." I didn't know what to say. Mason and I had always been close, but I'd never thought of our relationship as competitive. If anything, I'd always admired how easily he seemed to navigate life. "I just hope you can be patient with him," Aunt Vicky continued. "He needs your support right now." Her words felt off, like there was an unspoken message beneath them. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to manipulate me, though I couldn't figure out why. A few days later, I got an email from HR. They wanted me to come in for a follow-up meeting regarding the complaints against me. My heart sank as I read the message. This wasn't going away. If anything, it was getting worse. Harper noticed my mood during a lunch break and asked what was wrong. I hesitated, not sure if I should bring her into this mess, but eventually, I told her everything. "That's messed up," Harper said when I finished. "Do you have any idea who might be behind it?" "No," I admitted, "but I'm starting to think it's someone outside of work. Someone who has a personal reason to want me gone." Harper tilted her head. "Like who?" "I don't know," I said, my voice tight, "but I'm going to find out." That evening, I attended a family dinner at my mom's house. Aunt Vicky and Mason were there, along with a few other relatives. I kept an eye on Aunt Vicky throughout the evening, trying to pick up on anything that might confirm my suspicions. At one point, I excused myself to grab a drink from the kitchen, and as I was pouring myself a glass of water, I overheard Aunt Vicky and Mason talking in the next room. "I don't like this, Mom," Mason said, his voice low but tense. "It's too much." "It's necessary," Aunt Vicky replied, her tone firm. "You need to trust me." "What if he finds out?" Mason asked. "He won't," Aunt Vicky said, "as long as you keep your mouth shut." I froze, my heart pounding. They were talking about me. They had to be. I stayed in the kitchen until their conversation ended, then returned to the dining room, acting like nothing was wrong. But inside, I was seething. Aunt Vicky and Mason were up to something, and whatever it was aimed at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Aunt Vicky, my best friend and biggest supporter, had betrayed me. Mason, my cousin who I'd always thought of as a brother, was complicit. But why? What could they possibly gain from sabotaging me? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I spent the next week in a haze of anger and suspicion. Every time I thought about Aunt Vicky and Mason's hushed conversation, my blood boiled. They were plotting against me. It was the only explanation for the chaos in my life. But I didn't have any concrete proof yet, and without it, I was stuck playing defense. Harper noticed my distraction at work and pulled me aside after a meeting. "Zach, you've been off lately," she said, concern etched on her face. "What's going on?" I hesitated, debating whether to open up to her. Harper was one of the few people I trusted, but dragging her into my family drama felt unfair. Still, I needed an ally. "It's complicated," I said finally. "I think someone in my family is sabotaging me at work." Her eyebrows shot up. "What? Why would they do that?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I overheard a conversation that makes me think my aunt and cousin are behind the complaints against me." Harper frowned. "Do you have any proof?" "Not yet," I said, my jaw tightening. "But I'm going to find it." That evening, I started digging. I went through my work emails, looking for anything that might hint at foul play. Most of it was standard correspondence, but then I found something odd. An anonymous email forwarded to James. The message claimed I'd been neglecting my duties and treating my coworkers poorly. The tone was oddly formal, almost scripted. I stared at the email for a long time, my gut telling me it wasn't a genuine complaint. But there was no way to trace its origin. Whoever sent it had covered their tracks. The next day, I mentioned the email to Harper. "It's weird," I said. The way it's written doesn't sound like any of my coworkers. Do you think your aunt could have sent it? She asked. Maybe, I said. But how would she even know enough about my job to write something like that? Harper tapped her chin thoughtfully. Could she have gotten information from someone inside the company? Like, I don't know, Mason pretending to be you and calling HR? The idea made my stomach churn. It's possible, I said, but I don't know how to prove it. Harper leaned closer. Leave it to me. I know someone in IT who owes me a favor. Maybe they can trace the email. Her offer gave me a sliver of hope. If we could tie the email back to Aunt Vicky or Mason, I'd finally have the evidence I needed. Meanwhile, family interactions grew more strained. Aunt Vicky continued to act like nothing was wrong, but I noticed the way her eyes flicked to Mason whenever I walked into the room, as if they were silently communicating. Mason, on the other hand, seemed increasingly uncomfortable. He avoided me whenever possible, and when he did speak to me, his words were clipped and tense. At one point, I cornered him during a family gathering. Mason, I said, keeping my voice low, is there something you want to tell me? His eyes widened. What? No. Why would you ask that? You've been acting weird lately, I said. And I know you and Aunt Vicky have been talking about me. He looked away, his jaw tightening. You're imagining things. Mason, I said, my tone sharp. If you know something, you need to tell me. This isn't a game. He hesitated, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. For a moment, I thought he was going to come clean, but then he shook his head. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his voice shaky. Just leave me alone. He walked away before I could press him further. A few days later, Harper came through. She met me at a coffee shop after work, her expression triumphant. I got a lead, she said, sliding her laptop across the table. On the screen was a report showing the IP address of the anonymous email. It's registered to a home address, she explained. I cross-referenced it with public records, and guess whose house it belongs to? My stomach dropped as I read the address. It was Aunt Vicky's. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. She actually did it, I muttered. She's the one who sent the email. It gets worse, Harper said. The IT guy also found out that someone's been trying to access your employee profile remotely. They didn't get in, but the attempts came from the same IP address. I stared at her, the weight of the betrayal crashing down on me. Aunt Vicky wasn't just gossiping behind my back. She was actively sabotaging my career. And Mason had to be in on it. There was no way she could have done all this without his help. Fueled by anger, I decided to confront Aunt Vicky directly. I called her the next morning and asked if I could stop by to talk. She agreed, her tone cheerful and unsuspecting. When I arrived, she welcomed me with her usual warmth, but I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I know what you've been doing, I said, my voice cold. Her smile faltered. What are you talking about? The anonymous email, I said. The attempts to hack into my employee profile. I know it was you. Her eyes widened, but she quickly masked her shock with a laugh. Zachary, that's ridiculous. Why would I do something like that? That's what I'd like to know, I said, glaring at her. What could you possibly gain from trying to ruin my career? For a moment, she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. You don't understand, she said softly. I was trying to help Mason. Help him? I repeated, my voice rising. By destroying me? He's been struggling, Zach, she said, her voice pleading. You've always been the golden boy, the one everyone admires. Mason felt like he couldn't compete with you. I just wanted to level the playing field. Her words hit me like a slap. So you decided to sabotage me? To ruin everything I've worked for? It wasn't supposed to go this far, she said, tears welling in her eyes. I just wanted to give Mason a chance. I shook my head, disgusted. You didn't give him a chance. You gave him a crutch. And you tried to destroy me in the process. I'm sorry, she whispered. But the words felt hollow. I turned and walked out of the house, my chest tight with anger and betrayal. Aunt Vicky might have thought she was helping Mason, but all she'd done was tear our family apart. That night, I replayed our conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Aunt Vicky had admitted to sabotaging me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Mason's behavior didn't add up. If he was so desperate to outshine me, why had he seemed so conflicted? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I couldn't stop thinking about Aunt Vickis' confession. As much as I wanted to believe she told me everything, her story didn't fully add up. Mason's behavior during our last confrontation, his hesitation, the guilt in his eyes, suggested he wasn't entirely on board with her scheme. But if he wasn't, why hadn't he come clean? And why did Aunt Vicky seem so confident in her actions, even knowing the damage she'd caused? I needed answers, and I was determined to get them. The next few days at work were tense. Despite having evidence that Aunt Vicky had sent the email and attempted to access my employee profile, I couldn't exactly march into HR with that information. It wasn't enough to clear my name or stop the rumors. The damage had already been done, and unless I found a way to prove my innocence, my career would remain in jeopardy. Harper was a constant source of support. "You're not alone in this, Zach," she said one evening as we pored over the email logs again. "We'll figure it out." Her determination gave me strength, but I still felt like I was walking a tightrope. James's patience was wearing thin, and every interaction with my coworkers felt strained. I could tell some of them were starting to doubt me, and it hurt more than I wanted to admit. My next lead came unexpectedly. Chloe, my second cousin, reached out to me after hearing about the tension at work. Chloe and I weren't particularly close, but she'd always been honest, almost to a fault. "Can we talk?" she asked over the phone. "There's something you should know." We met at a small cafe later that afternoon. Chloe looked nervous as she stirred her coffee, avoiding eye contact. "What's going on?" I asked, leaning forward. "You said you had something to tell me." She hesitated, then blurted, "It's about Aunt Vicky." My chest tightened. "What about her?" "She's done this before," Chloe said, her voice low. "Maybe not to this extent, but she's always meddled in people's lives, especially when it comes to Mason. She's sabotaged relationships, spread rumors, anything to make sure Mason comes out on top." I stared at her, stunned. Why didn't anyone say anything? "Because she's good at covering her tracks," Chloe said. "And most people don't want to cause drama. But when I heard about what's happening to you, I thought you should know." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Aunt Vicky's actions weren't just a moment of poor judgment, they were part of a pattern. And if she'd done this before, it meant she was capable of much worse. With Chloe's warning in mind, I decided to confront Mason again. This time, I wasn't going to let him deflect. I found him at the gym, where he was working out alone. He looked surprised to see me, but he didn't try to run. "We need to talk," I said, my tone firm. Mason sighed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Look, Zach, I already told you I don't know what you're talking about." "Cut the crap, Mason," I snapped. "I know Aunt Vicky's been sabotaging me, and I know you're involved." His face paled, and for a moment, I thought he was going to deny it again. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a long breath. "I didn't want this to happen," he said quietly. "I told her it was a bad idea, but she wouldn't listen. So you just went along with it?" I demanded. "You let her destroy my career because you were too afraid to stand up to her?" "I didn't know how far she'd take it," Mason said, his voice rising. "She told me she just wanted to level the playing field, to give me a shot. I didn't think she'd actually—" He broke off, his hands clenching into fists. "I didn't want this, Zach. I swear." His words sounded genuine, but they didn't lessen the sting of betrayal. "Why didn't you stop her?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how," Mason said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's my mom, Zach. She's always controlled everything. I didn't know how to fight her." For the first time, I saw the cracks in Mason's confident facade. He wasn't the golden boy I'd always envied. He was a pawn in Aunt Vicky's games, just like I was. Harper and I spent the next few days combing through more evidence. With Mason's reluctant help, we uncovered a series of emails between Aunt Vicky and someone in my company's HR department. The emails were damning, full of carefully crafted lies designed to paint me as a problem employee. "She really went all out," Harper said, shaking her head. "It's like she's running a smear campaign." The more I read, the angrier I became. Aunt Vicky hadn't just made a few mistakes. She'd orchestrated a full-blown attack on my reputation, and she'd almost gotten away with it. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I scheduled a meeting with James and Emma, determined to clear my name. When the day arrived, I walked into the conference room with Harper by my side, the evidence clutched in my hand. James looked skeptical as I handed him the folder. "What's this?" he asked. "Proof that the complaints against me were fabricated," I said, "and proof that they came from someone outside the company." As James and Emma read through the documents, their expressions shifted from confusion to shock. By the time they finished, James's face was red with anger. "This is unbelievable," he said, slamming the folder shut. "Why didn't you bring this to us sooner?" "I didn't have all the pieces until now," I said, "but I couldn't let it go any further." Emma looked at me, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry, Zach. We should have looked into this more carefully." I nodded, relief flooding through me. The weight of suspicion had finally lifted. That evening, I called Aunt Vicky. When she answered, her voice was cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "It's over," I said, my voice cold. I showed the evidence to my boss. "They know everything." There was a long pause, and then she said, "Zachary, don't." I interrupted. "I don't want your excuses. You lied, you manipulated, and you nearly destroyed me. I don't care what your intentions were. You crossed a line." She didn't respond, and I hung up without waiting for her to. Exposing Aunt Vicky should have felt like a victory, but it left me with a strange mix of emotions instead. The weight of her betrayal still hung heavy on me. This wasn't just a professional setback, it was a personal one. I'd lost someone I once considered a second mother, and even Mason, who'd been my partner in crime growing up, now felt like a stranger. But there was no time to dwell on it. My career wasn't completely out of the woods, and I needed to focus on rebuilding my reputation. The first few weeks after my meeting with James and Emma were tense. Word had spread around the office that the complaints against me had been fabricated, but not everyone knew the details. Some of my coworkers were supportive, offering kind words and encouragement, while others seemed uncomfortable, as though they didn't know how to approach me. The cloud of suspicion hadn't entirely lifted. Thankfully, Harper was a constant presence. She'd always been a good friend, but our shared battle against Aunt Vicky had brought us closer. One evening, as we worked late to catch up on a client project, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You know, Zach, I've never seen anyone handle this much chaos with as much grace as you have." I laughed, the sound dry. "Grace? That's generous. I feel like I've been stumbling through this whole mess." "Maybe," she said, smiling, "but you've come out the other side stronger. That counts for something." Her words stuck with me, reminding me that, no matter how much damage Aunt Vicky had done, she hadn't broken me. At home, things were just as complicated. My mom, Rebecca, had been furious when she found out what her sister had done. She confronted Aunt Vicky in one of the most explosive arguments I'd ever witnessed. "How could you do this to Zach?" my mom shouted during a tense family meeting. "He's your nephew. Your family." Aunt Vicky, to her credit, looked genuinely remorseful, but her excuses rang hollow. "I was trying to help Mason," she said for what felt like the 100th time. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "It went exactly as far as you planned," my mom snapped. "You knew what you were doing, Victoria. You just didn't care about the consequences." The rest of the family sat in stunned silence, their loyalties divided. Some sided with my mom, condemning Aunt Vicky for her actions. Others tried to downplay the situation, arguing that family disputes shouldn't spill into the open. Mason, caught in the middle, looked miserable. For my part, I stayed quiet. I didn't trust myself to speak without letting my anger take over. When the meeting finally ended, I walked out without saying a word to Aunt Vicky. Despite the family drama, Mason continued to reach out. He seemed genuinely regretful, but I struggled to fully trust him again. One evening, he called me and said, "I need to apologize properly, Zach. Can we meet up?" Reluctantly, I agreed. We met at a park near my apartment, and Mason arrived looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. "I don't even know where to start," he said, sitting on a bench beside me. "I've been such an idiot. Mom's been controlling my life for so long, and I let her drag you into it. I should have stopped her. You should have, I said, my tone firm. But you didn't. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me anytime soon. I wanted you to know that I'm trying to make things right. I studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all I saw was a broken man trying to piece himself back together. I appreciate that, I said finally. But it's going to take time, Mason. A lot of time. I understand, he said, his voice quiet. I just hope we can get back to where we used to be someday. As the weeks turned into months, I focused on reclaiming my life. My performance at work improved steadily, and with Harper's encouragement, I started taking on more leadership roles. James, who'd been skeptical of me after the initial complaints, seemed to regain his trust in me. By the end of the quarter, he even recommended me for a company award recognizing outstanding contributions to the team. My personal life also began to stabilize. Harper and I grew closer, and what had once been a casual friendship began to shift into something more. One evening, after a late dinner, she leaned across the table and said, "You know, Zach, I don't think I've ever met anyone quite like you." I smiled, my heart skipping a beat. Is that a compliment? It's whatever you want it to be, she replied, her eyes sparkling. That night, as we walked home under the glow of the streetlights, I realized that, for the first time in months, I felt genuinely happy. Harper had been my anchor through the storm, and now, she felt like my future. As for Aunt Vicky, she didn't escape the consequences of her actions. Word spread through the family about what she'd done, and her once pristine reputation took a major hit. She tried to make amends, sending me long-winded apologies and even offering to help repair my professional connections, but I kept my distance. Mason, on the other hand, seemed determined to prove he was more than his mother's pawn. He quit the job Aunt Vicky had helped him get and started working his way up from the bottom at a new company. I need to earn this on my own, he told me one day. No shortcuts. I respected his decision, even if I wasn't ready to fully let him back into my life. I realized that Aunt Vicky's betrayal, as painful as it was, had taught me something important. It showed me the strength of my own resilience, the value of true friendships like the one I had with Harper, and the importance of setting boundaries, even with family. I wouldn't say I was grateful for what happened, but I could see the silver lining. I'd come out of it stronger, more self-assured, and ready to face whatever challenges life threw my way. And as Harper slipped her hand into mine one evening, smiling up at me with that look of quiet admiration, I knew one thing for sure. My future was mine to build, free from the shadows of anyone else's schemes. Mason reached out a few days later, apologizing profusely. "I'm so sorry, Zach," he said. "I should have stopped her. I should have told you sooner." I wanted to be angry at him, but I could see the guilt eating away at him. "It's going to take time for me to forgive you," I said honestly. "But I appreciate you coming clean." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "Thank you." For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Aunt Vicky's betrayal had shaken me to my core, but I wasn't going to let it define me. I had my job, my friends, and my integrity, and that was enough.